Good afternoon. My name is Faith, and I guess I run the show around here. At least I want to believe I do. So today's theme could simply have been called the calling of a leader, any leader. But Mel is a business leader, so we called it the calling of a business leader. More importantly, historically, there are those who have, from religious communities, who have sometimes distrusted business or thinking it wasn't quite kosher for a Christian to be in business. Those who believed and even preached that only those who serve within the church or, go out in the mission field in Timbuktu or Siberia or to other ends of the earth, that those are the only people who were really called. And fortunately, we don't believe that in Concordia. As good Lutherans, we preach and teach and practice the priesthood of all believers. Luther connected Christian calling to one's work or station in life, to quote my colleague Annie Simmons. Therefore, vocation belongs exclusively to this world, done primarily to serve the neighbor. So whether we are called to the business of teaching, preaching, discovering new things as scientists, and covering old facts as historians, or creating new jobs as business leaders, that is the place where we are to enact our vocation. That is the place to serve God by serving society and being stewards of nature. That is the place to exercise our talents, our gifts, and expertise. So here in Concordia, you'll find us in our classes, whether in arts and sciences, in business or education, asking the students, why are you here? And the question really is to lead to the discovery and discussion about calling and vocation, meaning and purpose. Because we understand, as the oft-quoted Frederick Buechner has said, the place God calls you is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. So God calls us to serve him by serving others this side of heaven. Even Oprah believes in calling, the queen of New Age religion, because she says there is no greater gift you can give or receive than to honor your calling. It's why you were born and how you become most truly alive. So join me in welcoming Mel Nelson as he takes us deeper into this topic. Mel is very well qualified to be leading us in this discussion because he has been in the business world for almost as long as I have been alive.
And that's a long time.
And that's a long time. In the last 12 years, he has led executive management systems through which he works with owners and CEOs and leadership teams in developing cultures of integrity and trust. So the primary focus of his business is CEO development, developing the leadership mindset, skill set, and culture to propel the enterprise forward. And Mel has spoken on these topics all over the place, not just in the US, but even internationally, and has recently published a book which, if you ask a question, we'll actually give you a copy. And he talks about a bridge metaphor in relation to leadership values. So thank you, Mel, for agreeing to be our speaker today. Welcome.
Thank you, Faith. Faith is doing such a good job, it'd be fun just to keep listening to her because she's got so much wisdom and insight to offer. It's really kind of fun to be here with you today. And one of the things I got to tell you right off the bat is that we've got a couple of Michiganders in the audience here to make sure that I stay close to the text and don't misrepresent anything when I'm talking about this model of the Mackinac Bridge. Those Michiganders are Chuck Hoagie sitting over here, up close and personal, and Jim Garten sitting right here. So Jim and Chuck, if there's anything I say that you seem to be disagreeing with or whatever, just feel free to chime in and give us, keep us honest and focused on the truth, because facts are pretty significant in this model, and I think you'll have some fun as we work our way through this topic. Now, I wanted to give you just a little bit of background. As an executive consultant, I know I run into cynics every now and then, and you probably all have heard the cynic who said, if you took all of the executive consultants in the upper Midwest and laid them end to end, that would be a good way to leave them. So we just kind of have to get over that and work through these different things and plow forward. But I've got to tell you right at the outset that I come from a long line of preachers. But in 9th grade, I was convinced that I wanted to go into electrical engineering. And one of my good friends, a good Norwegian, Arnie Tegelin, some of you may know Arnie, he's retired now, was a prophet, MSUM for many years. He told me when I was about 15, he said, Mel, the first question you need to settle is whether you're going to be a pastor or not. And so I took that into consideration. But as I went through high school and did well in science and math and other courses, history was one of my real loves. I found that going into engineering was an easy thing to do. And from there I went into power industry and telecommunications, and I gained a lot of insight there. But I want to tell you that taking this path, when Faith asked me to speak on the topic of calling, I thought that would be a fun topic to talk about, because you see, my brother was a pastor, my father was a pastor, my grandfather was a pastor, and my great-grandfather was a pastor. And if I went back further, I'd probably find there are more, but my great-grandfather really gives me a couple of ties to Concordia, because none of my family directly have gone to Concordia, but my second cousin is Jack Thunheim, who in 1974, when he was a junior here at Concordia, started writing this book, A Scandinavian Saga, pioneering in Newfoundland Township. And one of the connections he made there was the connection of my great-grandfather, who came under the influence of a man who had passed away long before he was born, by the name of Hans Nielsen Hauge. And many of you with your roots at Concordia know that this memorial is raised on the campus in the memory of this man. And Howard was telling me just 2 weeks ago that at the Concordia villages, language villages, that he was honored again. And just think about it. Here's a man that 200 years ago died, 1824, 190 years. But he's still having an impact today. And he had a huge impact on my great-grandfather, Samuel Thunheim. And when he came over from Norway and went to Augsburg for a while and landed in Newfoundland, he was planting Lutheran churches up and down the valley. And he came from a very strong, outspoken side of the Lutheran church. And my dad went through a... he was in a Lutheran Brethren church up in Saskatchewan. My grandfather had a degree from the Lutheran Brethren Seminary when it was in, not Fergus Falls, not Grand Forks. Do any of you know where the seminary was before then? Breckenridge, 1905. That same year, he built a house in Boston. My dad was born in 1910, and when he was a year and a half old, they emigrated up to Saskatchewan. And that Lutheran Brethren church in Frontier, Saskatchewan, was where my dad grew up. So we've got strong ties to the Lutheran faith. We've got strong ties in a family of pastors. But my dad served here in Fargo. He brought the family to Fargo when I was in 5th grade and served as the pastor at Bethel Free Church. And it's interesting when you look at Hans Nielsen Hauge, what he brought to the table, because he was not only an influential theologian, but he was an entrepreneur. And from your own website, we can find that he made significant advances in Norwegian industrialization. So when we talk about the calling of a businessman, it's fascinating to go back 190 years and more, because 190 years ago is when he died. But he had such a huge impact on so many people that when this memorial was dedicated to him in 1914, before the days of social media, 15,000 people showed up for the dedication of that memorial to his memory. Not in his home country, but in America. So just going back to the intro that Faith gave us, there's a tremendous impact for young men and women who feel a calling to be in the world of business, because we can have such a huge impact. And that's why these business luncheons, with the work that Jim Legler and others have done, and Faith has picked up the mantle. Faith, it's really been fun getting to know you in just the short time you've been here, there's a real solid purpose and mission for this kind of a luncheon. I'm really glad you're all here today. So let's dive in a little bit and take a little bit closer look. But before I get into this metaphor on the Mackinac Bridge, I want to just zero in on one of the statements that's on a plaque here. Because if we were to look long and hard and say, to what did Hans Nielsen Hauge owe his success? I think it was because he was faithful to the truth. That's in a theological sense. But truth is our friend in business. We never should be afraid of the facts. Facts are our friends. And that's one of the things that I think really has to be an important consideration. Now, Faith mentioned this book, Building Bridges, Today's Decisions, The Gateway to Your Future, that was published 2 years ago. It's been fun writing that because people will pick that up. They'll read it from the standpoint of a business book, but they'll also read it from the standpoint as a personal journey. And some see both, and some see more one than the other. But it's been a fascinating exercise for me because when I went through the process, I thought, should I put this in the book or not? And I said, it's my book. I can do anything I want. And my good friend Vern Dosh, who is the Chief Executive Officer at NISC, the National Information Solutions Cooperative. Do any of you know Vern? Vern's just coming out with a book now, and it's called Wired Differently. And you can think about that in many different contexts. I was wired differently from some of my kin that were called to be pastors because I wound up in the world of business. But Vern's written this book, Wired Differently, and I just had a chance to review that lately, and it's going to be a powerful book. I expect it'll be published in the first quarter of 2015. It's a story of his career at NISC and what they've been able to do based on the premise of doing the right thing always. So it's another book that's faith-based integrity in the workplace. And tying in with this theme of the calling of a business leader and integrity-based success, Vern gave me an endorsement for this book that I thought was fascinating in the context of our conversation today. He said, perhaps the most important aspect of the book for me was Mel's admonition that it is impossible to separate personal faith from business. I've struggled with this fact most of my career. Mel has helped me understand that a truly effective leader embraces the integration of his faith and his role as a leader because his faith is much more than a part of who he is. It is the essence of who he is. The two cannot possibly be separated because together they comprise the whole man. Now that was a lesson that in spite of the fact I believed that to be true, I still had to learn it a little bit the hard way. And one of the things that's so true about integrity is that we have to protect our integrity continually. And sometimes we have those we get close to, we think they're our friends, but they're really not. And I went through a situation a couple of years ago before I had finished this book where I had dear friends who I heard things coming back criticizing me for having a personal faith base for what I do. And I couldn't understand it because out of half a dozen people, I started going down the list. 5 of these people I had really solid relationships with. But it turned out one of them was the fly in the ointment that was spreading. Have any of you ever had that happen to you? It was one that was turning me against strong relationships I'd had with these friends for a long time. And it took me a while to figure it out. And when I did, every one of these friends except one said, you're on the right path, which was exactly affirmed by Vern here. We can't separate our faith from who we are because that's the essence of who we are. We can't separate faith from business. It doesn't mean we have to be proselytizing in business, but it doesn't mean that we have to hide our light under a bushel either. We can be who we are with total confidence. So that's just a little bit of the background. And what I wanted to do was to give you kind of an intro where I talked about the calling of a businessman today for this audience, but sandwich in between there a presentation that I gave at the FBI Northwest chapter of the National Academy of Associates last year. And I was invited by my friends Ozzy, Todd Osmondson, and Dave Todd. Ozzy was president of the chapter. And so I had a chance to come in and speak to men and women on the topic of integrity-based success. And the morning of that presentation, I was very pleased. I did not realize this ahead of time, that integrity is one of the 3 values that the National Academy has. Those three values are knowledge, courage, and integrity. And once I saw that, I just totally relaxed because I thought, I'm really going to have fun connecting with these people. And I told Ozzie and Dave at the time, I felt like I was in a place of high honor to be accepted with these folks and to sit and have a conversation because the values we shared went deep. And shared values are the basis for really strong relationships. And I believe in a creator who made us for relationships. He wants a relationship with us. And he wants us to model that in relationships we have with other people. And this is a relational model. You'll see that relationships is one of the key components of this model. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but this really is the heart of this. And I told Jim and Faith earlier, if they were nodding off because they'd seen it before, just poke them in the ribs. So here we are. This picture of the Mackinac Bridge was taken by my son about a year ago when he was going through the area. Michael had texted this to me, and he posted it on Instagram, and the state tourism department picked it up. They were so excited, they asked if they could have permission to post it on their website. And I don't know for sure how far this is from the bridge. If you look at this bridge, between the two big structures you can see on the far left-hand side of the screen and the other one just to the left of this trunk, that's 8,614 feet. It's over 1.5 miles. This is a huge structure. And when you're first driving up to the area and you see this bridge, you see this humongous bridge that's 26,000 feet, 5.2 miles long. And then you start to see the towers. And then you start to see the suspension cables coming through the mist. You can't see the suspension cables there. But each one of these are significant in this metaphor, in helping us understand a model that can explain not only business, but can be very relevant to our lives. I was first introduced to this bridge when I had my family on a vacation, and we went through the area in 1992. And this bridge is an incredible bridge. It was conceived 10 years after Gallup and Gertie, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, self-destructed. Have any of you ever seen videos of that bridge tearing itself apart? This bridge was designed initially to withstand a wind of 600 miles an hour. With improvements during the design, it'll withstand a wind of infinity. And the key is the flexibility. The towers will move 10 to 15 feet either way. The main part of the bridge will displace 35 to 40 feet and then gradually come back to center. It's an amazing example of engineering. How many of you have ever driven across that bridge? It's interesting because there's a grating that rises up on the base of the deck, and it's about 250 feet down. And if you look down, it'll give you a different sensation. I was speaking to one audience one day, and I said, have any of you ever been across that bridge? And Lewis was sitting in the back, about where you are, Jim. He said, yeah, I ridden my motorcycle across it 8 times. It was so much fun. They have a pilot service that'll take your car across if you're afraid of driving across the bridge. It's a remarkable piece of engineering. And it tells us some real interesting stories if we just let it speak to us. And these are captured along with the essence of this book on this bookmark with these 5 guiding principles for integrity-based success. So let's take a look at them for just a minute. This bridge weighs in at 1 million tons. 1 million tons. And the key to the bridge are these systems that work. When they built it, the first thing that went are these cable anchorages, these big structures right here. Then the footings and the towers. These footings go 200 feet down to hit bedrock. The towers stand 525 feet tall. Together, those footings and towers are 10 stories taller than the Washington Monument. The next thing that goes in are the suspension cables and the approach structure leading up to the main suspension bridge. And once those suspension cables are in place, they can string these risers in, support the deck, and you've got a model that represents values, relationships, leadership, and strategy. And notice when we talk that culture trumps strategy every time, these 3 areas of this bridge model really pertain very directly to culture. Now that bridge is 1 million tons. 35% are in the cable anchorages, 350,000 tons. 32%, 320,000 tons, are in the towers and the footings. 1% is in the suspension cables, and 32% are in the spans and the road deck. Now let me ask you a question. What percentage of the mass of that bridge do you think is beneath the water line? You never see it. It's impressive when you look at it, but beneath the water line you never see it. Anybody want to venture a guess? No such thing as a bad guess. 50%. Good guess. 75%. 75%, right on the money. 75% of that bridge is beneath the water line. You never see it. Some of you may know Mac Burns with Absolute Marketing. Mac and his crew helped me design this visual. And he said to me one day, he said, Mel, what do those footings look like? And I thought, well, they look like a can of soup. But just by asking that question, he got me thinking, and it's really pretty interesting. And that's why, like Faith said earlier, we're going to ask some questions. That's one of the most fun parts of this kind of a presentation, is to get into the questions and hear what your thinking is when you look at what people have seen before but think what no one else has thought. Good example of creativity. So I'm looking forward to some creative discussion as we continue moving forward, but this is really critical. Now, I want to make one more point. This million-ton structure is anchored in what? Bedrock. And whether you're talking about a personal life model or a workable business model, that bedrock should be truth. That's where the fun of this kind of a metaphor comes in. So when we look at these different systems, and I'll just review this by way of a quick graphic. Bridge weighs in at 1 million tons. We've got the cable anchorages, which go in first, then the footings and the towers. Then we've got the suspension cables representing leadership. And then we've got the spans, which represent strategy. And the percentages in each of those are, as I mentioned, 35% in the cable anchorages, 32% in the tower and footings, 1% in the suspension cables, 32% in the spans and the road deck. That's one of the reasons why 75% of what we don't see is going to contribute to the success of this model. That's what makes the bridge work. Let's talk about anchoring leadership behaviors in our values, because that's the function of these cable anchorages, is to anchor these suspension cables. Those cable anchorages represent values which drive behaviors and establish the culture of an organization. These three drivers of culture are pretty significant. Values, behaviors, and culture. If you got a sick culture, what's the problem? It's either behaviors or values or both in the organization. I've got a son that was in the Air Force for 8 years. When he was stationed out in Washington, D.C., we had a chance to go to the Air Force Memorial one day. Have any of you been to the Air Force Memorial? It's one of the relatively recent memorials there. They've got 3 arches that go into the air some 240 feet, simulating the contrails of the Thunderbirds. And just behind that, they have some bronze 8-foot statues standing guard. And beyond that honor guard is a wall with the values of the Air Force inscribed. Integrity first, service before self, excellence in all we do. It's quite an interesting study. And if you take a look at the values as they're described on the Air Force website, it makes for a really pretty good, interesting read. And again, we want to make sure that leadership behaviors are anchored in values, and that's the role of these cable anchorages. Now, there's 3 principles for strong relationships we also want to talk about. That's where the towers and footings come in. And the first principle is that, in my view, relationships are the net sum of personal integrity and personal awareness. Principle 2 deals with personal integrity, and principle 3 deals with that awareness piece. Personal integrity, principle 2, is the net sum of honesty and trustworthiness. If we're honest and trustworthy in all we do, we can go a long way in establishing our personal integrity. Honesty includes commitment to truth. It includes seeking the truth, telling the truth. Trustworthiness is doing what we say we're going to do and being dependable. It includes follow-through. Personal integrity, net sum of honesty and trustworthiness. Going back to the Air Force website, they make the statement that integrity is a character trait. It's the willingness to do what is right even when no one is looking. It is the moral compass, the inner voice, the voice of self-control, and the basis for the trust imperative. We having trouble building trust with other people? Is the problem us or is it them? Regardless, it's an integrity issue. Third principle here, personal awareness is self-awareness and other awareness. And over the years, I've been working with developing leadership in the executive suites and in top leadership circles in organizations. I found that this diagram of really balancing self-awareness and other awareness with informed conduct as to how we respond in situations, how we treat others, how we conduct ourselves, is really a very, very powerful paradigm, because we're combining two dimensions of understanding and one dimension of action. I'll come back and revisit that in just a minute. But the key principle taken away from all this is we should build relationships as we would a bridge, because we've got this tower of relationships based on these footings, which go down 200 feet, massive footings of concrete. And if you want to break those percentages down even further, where I said this total structure, footings and towers, was 32%, the towers themselves are 1%, but the footings of personal integrity and emotional intelligence are 31%, the total tonnage of the bridge. Those footings look like a big soup can. It goes down 200 feet. And they've got two pegs that come up and attach to the pedestals of those towers. Fascinating set of numbers for us to think about when we come back to the fact that 75% of what makes this bridge work is beneath the waterline. We never see it. So let's talk about leadership in the suspension cables. These suspension cables are a very fascinating part of the overall equation as well. Because when we talk about values-anchored leadership, we're talking about the net sum of character and conscience. Character is the total of the behaviors, mental and ethical qualities we bring to the table. Conscience is the moral goodness of one's intentions and conduct. So between these two, that's what we have. Now I'd like you to participate in an exercise with me for just a minute. Take your arms and join your hands over your head for a minute. You have now just about perfectly described a 24-inch circle. And that's the diameter of these two suspension cables. You can put them down. Thank you. That's about the diameter of these two suspension cables. If we look at the core of leadership, character, and come back to the facts of how this cable was spun over 78 days, wire a little bit smaller than your pinky, 41,000 miles of wire in these two suspension cables. The trolleys were going back and forth nonstop, 24/7, for 78 days as a crew of 300 men worked around the clock to weave those cables. And every time they had a complete strand of 5 cables, they would tension those strands and tie them off 5 at a time. Those wires aligned 5 at a time were combined to where 340 wires made one strand. And in this 24-inch cable, there are 37 strands that make up that cable. Now think about it, ladies and gentlemen. The backbone of this bridge is that character in the suspension cable. It needs everything else to make it work, but that's a critical part of the bridge system. The sheath, the conscience, is there to protect that character, because without that anti-corrosive paste and the steel shell that goes over the top of that, non-corrosive shell, that cable would be eroded. And eventually there'd be major problems. The bridge could fall into the straits. So each one of these different elements have significant aspect. And one of the questions that I was asked one time, sitting in a room of executives, Mel, we're told that leadership is really important. But I think your model's wrong because you've only got 1% there. This was a CEO of a $1 billion North Dakota corporation. And I kind of smiled and looked at him and addressed him on a first name basis, and I said, well, you could be right, but I said the 1% is kind of intentional on my part, and I kind of like it. Because you see, I run into too many business owners and business executives, and they think it's all about them. And it's not. It takes everybody else to make the organization work. So it's kind of a way of right-sizing executive egos. And my friend Loris Mulbert shared this book with me, It's Not About You, by Bob Berg and John David Mann. If people want to follow you, they need to trust your character. What creates character? Perhaps it's the choices you make. And I went on in this situation, and I said, you know, it's my conviction, based on the experience I've had, that if there were a Center for Disease Control, current topic, for the executive suites, the #1 pandemic would be narcissism. And I've never failed to get that kind of a response from a group like this. People start chuckling because they know exactly what I'm talking about. And I said, this bridge is not going to operate without those suspension cables in place. That 1% makes all the difference between whether it works or not. But it is only 1%. And let's be a little bit humble and realize it takes all these other moving parts to make these businesses and these organizations thrive. So when we've got values-anchored leadership, we've got these aspects to it, our character and our conscience, that are really important pieces of that. We've talked about leadership being the 1% factor and narcissism being a terrible challenge. Manfred Kitz de Vries is an individual who's a psychologist who's written a book called The Leader on the Couch. I would commend it to you because it's a pretty interesting book. My son's going through a doctoral program in Colorado, and I saw that on a shelf one day. I said, boy, I should get a copy of that book. I did, because he's got a whole chapter on narcissism. American Psychological Association has a list of 30 characteristics. If you've got 5 or more, you've got problems with narcissism. And it makes for an interesting read. If you're focused on power, status, prestige, and glamour, ability to manipulate others, you're able to establish rapid, if shallow, relationships as you move up the corporate ladder. Motivation, selfishness. Success, fleeting. Poof, soot, ephemeral. It's a good book. Take another look at narcissism. It guarantees an erosion of trust. Self-interest destroys trust. And the best way to describe this is in a mathematical model which gets across a powerful concept. And it's simply this: trust is the net sum of credibility, reliability, and intimacy divided by self-interest. Think about that for a minute. Trust is indirectly proportional to self-interest. The bigger the self-interest, the lower the trust. The lower the self-interest, with the higher net sum of credibility, reliability, and intimacy, the stronger the trust. Now, does this formula apply only in our personal lives? Does it apply in business? It's universal. It's a human nature principle we're talking about here. John Dixon wrote the book Humilitas, and he talks about humility making the great greater for 5 powerful reasons. Humility is common sense. It's not possible for one person to know all things. It's beautiful. It has a winsomeness about it that attracts people to it. It leads to new knowledge. It's persuasive, and it's inspiring. So this 1% factor in this leadership model, I think, is really powerful because it might help us right-size our egos just a little bit. Let's talk about outcomes for just a minute. Trust is a result of integrity-driven behavior. And David Horsager has written a book called The Trust Edge. Makes the point that trust is indispensable in business today and is the commodity that's disappearing more and more in our society, and has become more linked to computer-mediated communication. We spend more time in emails and text. We're less connected on that visceral level. Trust suffers. In the 21st century, trust has become the world's most precious resource. Everything of value is built on trust, everything. And a lack of trust is your biggest expense. Now again, is this true just in business or in our personal lives? Both. Both. There's another principle that I think is important, is to think of integrity as the integrated whole. What makes this bridge work is the integration of all these systems working together. seamlessly. And the same is true of us individually. Dr. Henry Cloud has written a book on integrity, talks about the integration of character, and this is a book, a powerful leadership book I'd highly commend to all of you. He talks about integrity as the ability to connect authentically, to be oriented towards truth. There we see it again. Hans Nielsen Hauge knew that 200 years ago. To work so as to get results and finish well, to embrace, engage, and deal with the negative, to be oriented towards growth. And the sixth one is to be transcendent, to see the big picture, which means looking above the fracas, being able to look to the horizon beyond and put things into context, even if we've had a bad day, a bad week, a bad month, a bad quarter, a bad year. 6 key principles of integrity. And that brings me back to this 3D leadership model, which now becomes a 4D leadership model, because to these 3 dimensions we have to add the dimension of truth, conscience, and character. Now we've got something we can really work with. So this principle of integrity as the integrated whole is a pretty powerful principle. It's a principle that's reflected through this bridge. It's a principle that's reflected in business. It's a principle that if we can leverage that in our personal lives, we're much better off. As I talked earlier, these 5 foundational principles are captured on this outline. And I'd just like to leave you with this thought about this bridge. Creativity can be defined as looking at what everyone else has seen, but thinking what no one else has thought. We've got that kind of creativity that was built into us by our Creator. And metaphors are a powerful way to communicate. I hope you've had as much fun today as I've had working with this, and I really look forward to the questions you're going to ask. This works because it's based on truth. And that was what I had to share, Faith, today on your assigned topic of the calling of a business leader. So I think we're ready for some questions. Yes.
I was interested in how quickly you moved from the faithfulness to the truth to talking about facts. And I've always seen a difference between a fact and truth. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Be happy to. One of the things I believe is that facts are very stubborn things that are out there. And facts have cues as to how they're to be interpreted. I've always been a student of history. When I came down from Canada with my family, I was halfway through the 5th grade. And I joined that class at Horace Mann Elementary in January. And my mother saw potential in me, and she was quite a student herself, and she said, I'm going to work with you. We're going to go out and nail this. I had a list of 268 questions on U.S. history. And I was one of 3 students recognized at Horace Mann in 3 months for outstanding knowledge of U.S. history, because I've been so committed to facts and understanding. And to me, the two go hand in hand. Is that a good answer to your question?
I think about the value of eyewitnesses in any kind of accident or incident, that people see differently the same thing.
Well, and that's a very good point. One of the things we have to do is be careful to establish the facts. But once we've established the facts, we need to run with them. And in a multitude of witnesses, things are confirmed. So we need to be careful how we do that. But one of the things I see as a really disturbing trend today, and maybe some of you feel the same way, is that we sitting here today tend to cast disparagement on eyewitness accounts of people that were there at the time, say, no, it wasn't that way. And we don't have a better set of insights than what they had. So my concern is we always need to be very close to stick to the facts. And having served on jury duty, I really think that's an important thing. But you raise a good point. Thanks for that question. Yes.
We all know business leaders who are honest and trustworthy. Can you wrap yourself around transparency a little bit? Because that sometimes is lost in translation, if that makes sense.
I think there are things that people need to drop the walls of defensiveness, particularly in leadership roles, and open up and be very disarming. That's one of the things that my friend Vern Dosh does. I think there are others in this room that do the same thing. I think it's very important to be transparent, and part of that transparency is tied into humility. And one of the things that's fun when you read about effective leaders is when you start to take the focus off of you and put it on that other person, now you're engaging in dialogue. It's not your reputation you're trying to protect. People are asking direct questions just like you are. And when you open up and are vulnerable, that's a huge trust builder. Maybe you've studied some of the books on how you create trust with others. But one of those things is to take the first step and be vulnerable. And Vern talks in his book, Wired Differently, about a point where they were concerned that they had a information processing system that was based on a very old and outdated and antiquated business language, computer language called COBOL. And he was talking with one of their biggest competitors down in St. Louis. Because of circumstances, he couldn't make the flight connection, so this CEO drove him over. They had a 3-hour drive to catch a plane from another town. And during that time, this other CEO was totally vulnerable, dropped his guard, and told them they were thinking about doing a major project redo. This costs millions of dollars, and it's a long event. And as soon as he did that, Vern dropped his guard. And the way that story ended is because of that transparency, they were able to put together a deal where they merged both of those businesses. And instead of spending twice, they spent once and had stronger organization. It's quite a compelling story. It's a good answer to your question. Thanks for asking the question. It's a great one.
In your work, have you run across people that exhibit narcissism and lack of integrity, and you've seen them change?
And the last
How
part,
often do you see them change from a lifetime of being on the other side?
unfortunately, narcissism is frequently a terminal condition. And the only way that we can get through that sometimes is sometimes we have to intervene and not be intimidated by them. I'll give you an example. In one of the leadership sessions I had with a group over an extended period of time, I was sitting in a room like this, and one of the ladies back in the corner over here, Peg, had a big smile on her face for about 2 hours. And during the break, I said, Peg, you've been smiling all afternoon. What's going on? She said, well, it works. It really works. I said, what works? Share it with me. She said, what you told us to do a year ago. And she was in a situation where she had a male. Now, this doesn't happen very often, does it? She had a male that was a perfect example of narcissism. And what I told people in this situation, understanding this 3D model, understand yourself, understand how, when you run into some of these folks that are wired this way, you can't hit them over the head with a 2x4 because it'll break. And a 4x4 will break. You got to take a 6x6, and if that breaks, you better have a spare. And don't worry if you have to hit them hard and they come back with anger. Hit them again. And you know, you ladies have an intuition that often us men do not have, so go get them. Go get us when we need to be gotten. But she took and came right at this individual. And it was in an industry where there's a real caste system. She hit him really hard. And he was totally surprised because no one had ever done that before. And I told these folks, I said, you'll be shaking in your boots when you do this, but don't worry, do it. It's the right thing to do. And chances are, after they've had a chance to think about it, they'll come back and thank you for it. This guy came back and thanked her after 2 days. And this wasn't a problem just with her. It was a problem with a number of ladies in this business. And her CEO also thanked her for taking that head-on approach. And her CEO was a lady. So this was a problem that was endemic. So by focusing on the truth, this is what you did, this is what we expect, this is wrong, you're alienating a lot of co-workers. This can't continue. That's where we really leverage the truth on the basis of observation. And we can have a huge impact when we shine the light of truth. Henry Cloud's written another book called Necessary Endings that talks about how people respond to truth. And he's based this on one of the Proverbs in the book of one of Solomon's Proverbs in the book of Proverbs, that the fool, when you shine the light on him or her, The problem's never in the room. It's somebody else. And this is pretty typical of narcissists. They're going to blame something else. The wise man thanks you for taking the time to be transparent and confront and adjust course. But it's rare to see narcissists turn around because they're so vetted in that role. But it takes courage, and it takes people like you and I and others to speak directly to them to bring about a change. Great question. Thank you.
That was work to get the mic over here. A lot of us in this room are approximately the same age. And in today's Fargo-Moorhead community, there's a lot of young startup companies that are just getting going. So I'd be interested in the experiences that you've had working your model with 25-year-olds that are starting companies, just getting into leadership roles. I would think you would find everything's very relevant, but do your approaches change? How do you find it works with young folks?
Chuck, that's a really good question. And I have been absolutely amazed because I thought as I got more miles on the odometer, it's another euphemism, I would have less relevance to the younger generation. And I'm finding exactly the opposite to be true. I got the same question from an attorney in a group. And I said, I want to go back to what Will Rogers said back in the 30s. It ain't what we don't know that's the problem. It's what we know that ain't so. And we in America today are building walls. We're building walls between generations. And what's been absolutely amazing to me is some of the best conversations I've had have been with these young folks who are in their 20s and 30s. They're hungry for the wisdom that you and I have acquired the hard way. Experience is a better education than the college degree, but the tuition is higher. And these kids today know they can learn from us if they but have the patience to sit and have a conversation. Now, I'm not talking about those that are texting all the time and so caught up in electronic communications that they can't build relationships. And that's a huge problem today. But there are a lot of young people out there, Chuck. And I've had some great conversations just in the last 2 weeks with folks of the younger group. I had a flight I was taking about 8 months ago, and I had a young guy sit next to me who was a startup company here in Fargo. And I said, I'm just blown away. Why are you so interested in probing my mind and asking me to speak to this? He said, because I'm smart enough to know that if you can tell me something that's going to help me avoid a mistake, I want to know it. And that's been the rule for me rather than the exception. So that's a great question, Chuck. Now, is that a good answer to your question? You want to do a follow-up question? Okay. If you ask a follow-up question, you get another book, but you got to read both of them. Any other questions? There's no problem if you want to break early because we've got, we're sitting here at 12:47 and it's always nice to be respectful of people's time. Any other questions anybody wants to ask? If not, it's been, oh, here we go.
I'll throw one out here. 2008, there was obviously a financial crisis when Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, large banks, large insurance companies were led by people or individuals that didn't follow your business model. Do you see that as having changed today at all, or is the corporate culture still in that, well, yeah, is there going to change in that, or do you think your business model has not been adopted by some of the large corporate culture businesses and leaders?
That's a great question. And if you'll just bear with me for a minute, I've got a couple of slides that I pulled out because I didn't know if we'd have time that I think really speak very directly to that. comparing bridges and businesses with the economic tsunami of 2008 in mind. Businesses fail and bridges fail. And this is a fun thing. I co-authored a book with a colleague, John Butler, in Dublin, Ireland. And one of the things I think that's really instructive is to look at failure. Bridges fail rarely, but businesses fail frequently. What can we learn? And ladies and gentlemen, in a nutshell, if the integrity of the bridge is in doubt, it'll fail. If the integrity of the business is in doubt, it will eventually fail. And unfortunately, we still haven't learned a lot of the lessons we've needed to learn from 2008. Because if we look at the rate at which failures are occurring, bridges, there have been 5 major failures in 137 years. They're rare and the loss of life is decreasing. Business failures are going the other way. When I was doing research on this, I went looking to see what I could find. There's a lot of information on why CEOs succeed, or why CEOs fail, or why businesses succeed. Have you ever tried looking for a business article or a business book on why businesses fail? They're hard to come by. Really hard to come by. And I found one that did research over the 25-year period from 1981 to 2006. And because publicly traded companies have to file so many reports, it's easy to get your hands on the data. There were 423 bankruptcies in the U.S. in companies and corporations with assets greater than 500 million in those 25 years. And to look at each of them was very fascinating. There are some incredible stories there. But it's getting worse, because in 2002, Enron was a 63 billion failure. Lehman Brothers in 2008 was a 600 billion failure. But it gets better than that, because if we look at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that we bailed out, absolutely incredible. Now, Treasury Secretary Paulson said, "I attribute the need for today's action when the subprime mortgage crisis hit to the inherent conflict and flawed business model embedded in the GSE structure." And a GSE is a government-owned corporation, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Rotten business model for the reasons we've talked about. Running from the truth. Running from the truth. It's written all over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. That's not, ladies and gentlemen, a political statement. That's a matter of fact. The deals that were done, the loans that were done foolishly. I need to be careful because I've got Dorothy here and Delton here. Am I fair in saying what I said, Dorothy, Delton? That would have been a $1.7 trillion failure. Have we fixed the fundamental problems that caused those to fail? I don't think so. The problem's still out there. And it's a flawed model that comes back basically to the nature of man, and why I think your question ties in very directly as a nice wrap-up for this conversation on why it's so important to have a Center for Business Ethics at Concordia, and why it's so important to be encouraging our young men and young women to pursue a calling in business if that's what they feel is important. And that's why it's so important for you and I to model the values and the integrity and share our wisdom gained the hard way with these younger generations. We need to reach across this generational divide and put out of mind all this stuff that says the generations don't get along, and say we can have a great dialogue if we are transparent. So it's been my pleasure to be here today. Thanks so much for these great questions. I'm always learning. I've learned a lot today from what you've had to offer. Faith? Thank you.
There's absolutely nothing for me to add. Thank you so much, Mel. And please go and live out your calling, whether that's in the world of business or the business of the world. Thank you so much for coming, and hopefully we shall see you next month when Maggie Bailey will be talking about legacy leadership. That's 10th of October. Thank you.